Welcome on stage Mr. James Felton Keith with a speech about the autonomous Internet of Everything.
Right. All right, everybody. How are you? Thank you for inviting me to Poland. This is going to be a bit interactive. If you can all open your phones, there's an application on the phone where you can take a survey with 2 questions that we'll come back to, and I'll try to answer for you at the end of my talk. And we'll do some Q&A about what the autonomous Internet of Everything is, and at least where we see the future going in some of our research. So I'll just get right into it. We're at the very beginning of a paradigm shift. I know the word big data has been around for quite a while. FinTech has been around for quite a while. At least people in the bubble, think about it that way. But the sheer amount of data that we're creating is a very new thing. Every day, about 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are created by individuals, by us. That's a ridiculous number. It's 18 zeros. It's like a billion times a billion. And it's necessary to kind of put this in perspective with the speed of change or the acceleration of innovations. I was at a conference about 3 weeks ago in Michigan at Wayne State University called the Big Data Symposium. It's the largest symposium in that region around big data. And it's at a university, and I was approached by a bunch of students who are in the information technology program at that university, and they asked, what are we doing? Like, what's happening here? What is this event about? I said, well, it's the Big Data Symposium. You should know. I said, have you ever heard of big data? Have you ever heard of that prefix on data? And they said no. These are 19, 20-year-old kids, and they don't know what big data is. And then I sat back and thought about it. The first big data symposium that I'd ever gone to was, I believe, in 2009. It was the first time that I heard that language used. And language is really important in how we understand each other, how we understand things, and how we brand the happenings that are changing around us. And so big data itself is less than 10 years old, right? And now it's transforming into something that I'm more focused on, which is the personalization of big data, or what we're calling personal data. Personal data is the idea that the high volumes, velocity, and variance of big data are starting to become very specific to the individual. And of that new phenomenon, I think it's necessary to understand that over the course of the past 2 years, humans have outpaced all of the information that they've created since we started cataloging the human experience. And that's because of that 2.5 quintillion bytes of data that we generate every single day. Behind me, you'll see a graphic that I believe LinkedIn published originally. And it really showcases the pace that new technologies are adopted by consumers. This is the 50 million mark for a variety of different products and services that you're all familiar with. It took 68 years for 50 million people to fly on a plane. It only took 2 years for that many people to adopt Twitter. Now, obviously, the cost is different. The barrier to entry is lower. But just the fact that we're able to distribute new technologies so widely, so fast, is transforming everything. And it's necessary to keep that in mind when you start considering how things will change in the future. Or, I hear a lot of conversation right now about if things will change as fast as folks say they are. If autonomous vehicles will be here tomorrow, if autonomous medical services will be here tomorrow, if technologies of sorts will be communicating with each other in the way that futurists suggest tomorrow. And the reality is it's coming a lot quicker than you might think. Just some of the things that are autonomous that I think we're more regularly familiar with are things like autonomous dating, or rather, people use an app to find someone that might like them as much as they like themselves, or might hate them as much as they hate themselves. That can be debated. Autonomous driving is coming. I know I live in New York City, and in the state of New York, our governor has set in his 2018 budget tens of millions of dollars to build out infrastructure that will support autonomous vehicle programs. So it's already in the budget. This isn't a 10-year away thing. It's more like a 24-month deal. And also, autonomous food, autonomous ordering, things like that. There are applications for all these things, but start to consider what it might look like when all of these services are delivered to you, whether you request them or not, just based on a precursor of settings. Even in the medical field, you have now, which is a radically new thing, unions of different sorts of medical professions coming together to fight what they think is automation. So anesthesiologists, radiologists, and a variety of other highly skilled people are trying to set in checks and balances per their industry to avoid eliminating their jobs, these jobs that they've spent so much money and time developing themselves for. And the kick is, the most interesting piece is, as any instance of our lives is digitized or appified, or where we pull data from, has the more recent ability now to be communicated to other applications, other sectors of service, other governments, you name it. So when we talk about the autonomous Internet of Everything, I think we should be considering that everything in existence will eventually become a device. Everything in existence will be just oozing with data and information about it, whether we're actively doing it or not. There are sensors in this building, there are cameras in this facility that we're in that are clocking data on us constantly, whether we're aware of it or not. And all of those sensors are communicating to each other, and they're helping us make decisions faster and better than we ever could before. Now, I like to define personal data. I know that it's a term that Europeans are relatively familiar with. I have to do a lot more education when I'm back in the United States. But at the International Personal Data Trade Association, we like to divide personal data into 5 categories. Your location data, your Internet of Things data, which is now the Internet of Everything, your health data, your finance data, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about that in FinTech here, and also your insurance data, which is really the data that sets the tone for how you value the information that makes up your life. I know different countries, different nation states like to regulate information per industry, but we find that if they regulate it per function, that they'll get a lot more bang for their buck, because industries are starting to converge on each other. And as it was mentioned earlier, the most valuable companies right now are the companies that do a great job of not only innovating, but pulling information from innovation. And I think it's really changing the way we value not only institutions that we interact with, but also how we value ourselves. But there is a fear. I think it's understandable that technology might run amok, and it might leave us behind, and that robots are going to take our jobs. And regarding jobs, that might be true, the jobs that we're aware of today. But the one thing that it won't be able to take is our value. So I'm constantly presented with scenarios where people are asking what to do when a robot steps in robot being a physical thing like hardware or a non-physical thing like software. So robots come in all forms, things you can touch and things you can't touch. They ask about if we're going to be able to protect against the, automation, I don't think that's a word, of the work that we used to do. And my regular response is that we have to change our idea of work, and we also have to change our idea of value. What's really happening is as we clock information from every single interaction that we have, every movement that we experience in physical space, it's affecting some decision process. It's affecting some robot. It's affecting how we automate the world around us. And we should be acknowledged as valuable in that regard. And it's different than work. Our influence, our value, our input is quite different than work. And that's where, we kind of landed on personal data as an asset class. I believe it was about 2010, right after the first big data conference that I attended, that the World Economic Forum published a paper that called personal data the new asset class. And we see it as an asset class, something that can be securitized and traded and valued in all sorts of ways per the same market structure that we use to distribute value to identifiable institutions, whether that be, on a stock exchange or some other sort of debt market or currency market or you name it. Personal data just happens to be the most micro evidence of value that we can transact. So I think the future is more about transactions than it is about work in the old sense of the word. But none of this technological stuff is really, I think, at the core of my concern or the core of most people's concerns. When they address their fears, they're worried about becoming obsolete. And Europeans are by far eons ahead of the rest of the world, especially with this new legislation called the GDPR. The General Data Protection Regulation is a vast sweeping thing, but really it does two things. It establishes cybersecurity, compliance priorities, and that's fine. Companies will do their best or they won't, and they'll be retaliated against for compliance. But the other thing that the GDPR does is it establishes where value comes from, and it gives individuals or these influencers some agency over their input. And in my opinion, that's the really important thing. And it does this in a pervasive way. There are about 11 articles in the 99 or so article GDPR that elaborate on how employers interact with individuals' information. The majority of my work these days is outside of my portfolio of fintech and insurtech companies, which I have a few, and it's more in conversations with labor unions and governments about how they use these 11 or so articles to identify new opportunities to distribute the value that they know employees create at institutions. And that's a really big deal. It's in fact the biggest deal, because I think when people consider the wage gaps or inequality or inclusion in general, these buzzwords that we always hear coming around, what they're really talking about is how do we better distribute all the productivity that is constantly being created in the world. And with that in mind, I would encourage all of you to reject the idea that robots and robotics and automation in general can take your job. In fact, they're doing your bidding. I think one problem that I'm usually presented with is, what do we do when Alexa, one of Amazon's products, orders milk for your refrigerator because it knows that it's regularly there and it doesn't see it? It doesn't sense it. Its sensors don't know about it. And people use a very basic problem like that to ask the question, am I taking out of the equation because Alexa and my refrigerator are doing all the work for me? With some applications in the middle. My response to that would be that they're not doing the work without you. Robots do not do work without human beings. They do work for human beings. Technologies of all sorts, whether they're software or hardware, are in fact extensions of our humanity. And so we're just rejecting the idea that we only have 2 hands and can do so much work. Now we have 200 hands. And because we're 200 times as productive, we should be indemnified at least 200-fold for our input and the things that we need. And that includes whether we're just consuming things. So that's it. And I want to get to the results from the survey that was in you all's application. And I don't know if I know how to do that. Okay, someone did it for me. Great. I can actually see, so I'm just going to check this out. All right. Okay, how much data in the world in the past 2 years? And how many years did it take debit cards? Okay, so all of that information was presented in this presentation. And with that said, I think we're going to go to some Q&A. Are there any questions? Okay, and there are no questions. Okay, so I'll use my my extra 8 minutes to, I think, elaborate. Unless a question comes, I'm happy to be interrupted to discuss or consider any of these ideas. But I think the main thing that I try to get across to individuals and institutions that I work with on a daily basis is that last thing that I talked about, which is that robotics and technologies are an extension of our humanity. And if we don't start writing policies and procedures at our institutions, whether they be governmental or for-profit or not-for-profit or you name it, we will fail to prop up humanity in the way that we have over the course of the past, during the industrial age. So, and I get that there's a real concern there that, as automation takes its place, that everyone will be left without anything to do. And even aside from the idea that they'll be left without a check, that they'll be left without the sense of existence that I could say at least my parents had when they started working. But I don't think that that's an actual problem. When I consider people who are young enough to be my children, and I'm probably the oldest person who would call themselves a millennial, they all want to be entrepreneurs of sorts. And none of them consider themselves to be a consumer or a customer. They consider themselves a separate entity that's doing a transaction with either you as an individual or you as an institution. And I think it's really important to consider it that way. When you think about marketing and advertising, or whether you're a product person, you think about how to distribute products in general. The distribution problem that's happening is we're not acknowledging individuals as a valuable piece of the product development and distribution equation. When I started my career, I designed car seats for the Chrysler 300. I designed the seats, and I designed the airbag that blows out of the outside portion of the seat. And I did that work as a contractor. I started my career at the very tip of the 2000s, and a very common way that institutions worked with new engineers at that point was as independent entities, as contractors of sorts. And it's the only reason that I got as much responsibility as I did when I started. But I also had no equity stake, or no stake in general, in the sorts of products and services that I influenced during my time at the company. And we built that product in every country. We also influenced other adjacent products on the interiors, in the wiring, in the body and white of the vehicle. And when I was finished with that company, I was also finished with my ability to generate an income based on that company and based on the future success of those products, which are still, in production today. And this is nearly 15 years later. Now, I'm not saying that I should have the total value of those products that were built way back then. There was a large group of engineers and other influencers that participated. But one thing that this new era, or the past 24 months of data collection has done is it provides real evidence that I participated. And for all of you and the companies that you work with, it also provides real evidence that you participated in the products and services that your firms create. Even if you're a project manager and you're managing the flow of business, you are still part of the value equation, product by product. Most companies only grow in one of two ways, either by projects or by products. So no matter what the model is for your firm to grow, they're actively collecting information with regards to how you participate in that production process. New policies like the GDPR acknowledge that. They acknowledge that you are a valuable participant, and they really give our culture a new opportunity to have a new conversation with people, which is the fact that they are valuable. That's what big data and now personal data do. Formerly, abstract conversations about value are now put into some sort of factual metric that people can leverage to argue on their behalf that they should be paid a livable wage or an astronomical wage for their contribution. And I think that is a good sign of where we're going as a species, as cultures, as people specific to nations and states across the world. I think it definitely shows that we are not doomed, even though technology is upon us. So I'll leave you with that. If there are no questions.
There is a question.
There is a question.
Okay, here. Hello. I like your metaphor concerning that we won't have 2 hands anymore, but 200 hands.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a concern that, okay, individuals, we might gain some convenience gains, but isn't it like that people are afraid that all these gains of the technology revolutions would be completely disproportionately distributed to the owners of the technology, that there's gonna be a narrow group of people who will have thousands or millions of hands, owners of Alexa, Google, and so on,
Yeah.
and all us ordinary people will be still left out with our 2 hands, because the history shows that all that productivity gains we have witnessed in the last 50 years,
Yes.
in terms of capitalism, we are not the real beneficiaries of them. People still work more and more. So how would you address this concern?
Okay, great question. I want to do a cartwheel. No, so that was an awesome question. Here's the kick. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States, and you can go to the BLS.gov website right now, they measure productivity as, or they establish productivity as a measure of inputs, right? And so they even do a cute video on the website that talks about this woman who makes birdhouses, and they mention the different things that are inputs to her birdhouses, and they show she is able to streamline this process and grow it over time, and she's also putting intellectual property, or her time and sweat, as an input to this productivity. And productivity, skyrockets over time, of course, as she throws these inputs. And you're right in what you established, that right now she owns all of the asset, the underlying asset that she draws value from, which is productive, which is the birdhouses. But with personal data, we have a new way to distribute ownership. The kick is, and what the GDPR is an early start to, is identifying ownership of personal data, which is, in my opinion, the core asset class. So our best way to tackle inequality is to better distribute ownership of this asset class, so that wherever you participate, you have the opportunity to grow as the economy grows, and the sea level all rises together. And time is up. But I'll be here all day. I see another person. Okay, sure.
Okay. Hello, my name is Carolina Wesik. I work at S&P Global.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to ask a more social perspective question. I'm 23 years old, and the majority of my friends despite graduating from business schools or law schools, now are creating applications and do not see themselves in big corporate companies. And I wanted to ask about, given the fact that we have so many innovative companies around the world, we still have a lot of traditional businesses on which we rely on a daily basis. And given the fact that now the next generation doesn't see themselves in those companies, how quick do you think the traditional business will disappear? Because from my perspective, it looks like we have two different forces going against each other. We have the business perspective, and we have the social perspective, where the labor force just, has different expectations.
Well, okay. So, business is a social thing. We think about the rise of capitalism, which, succeeded feudalism. What really happened is you all in Europe went to war, and countries needed to grow faster, and so they started distributing ownership faster and faster. When you say traditional type of business, I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean, because all businesses are constantly evolving to meet the markets. What I would say is that we will see, I think going in the future, and we're seeing it right now, more participation with smaller and smaller entities. So large corporations will really look like a collective of small groups, but that's always kind of been the case. Facebook acquired dozens upon dozens of companies. They look like a big firm now, but they actually acqui-hired a bunch of bright individuals that they thought could come and build products and services for them. So I gotta go. I think the Deputy Prime Minister is here, but thank you all for your time. Yeah. Right.
Thank you, Mr., for your speech.